Hi, everybody. My name is Susan Williams. I'm the European History Professor here at GRCC, and I'd like to welcome you all tonight to one of our events for our third annual Black History Month here at GRCC. I wanted to, first, before I forget, because I know I will, we did pass out these evaluations. We'd really appreciate if you would take the time to fill them out. We'll collect them at the end today. This is just for our purposes, but it gives us a nice idea about how you're responding to the events that we have here at GRCC. So we'd appreciate you taking a little bit of time and filling this out for us. We're here tonight to welcome Dr. Richard Thomas. He's a professor of history at Michigan State University. Dr. Thomas earned his PhD at the University of Michigan in 1976, and he is author and co-author of several works, including Understanding Interracial Unity, a study of U.S. race relations, Life for Us is What We Make It, Building a Black Community in Detroit, Racial Unity, an Imperative for Social Progress, and Detroit, Race and Uneven Development. Dr. Thomas is here tonight to present his paper, From King to Obama, Reflections on a Changing Era, and welcome.
Can they hear me with this, or? Okay. Well, thank you all very much. This event is going to give me an opportunity. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. Okay. Okay. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, that's much better. Okay. You guys were being very polite. You probably couldn't hear me in the back, but thank you. But anyway, this event will give me an opportunity to share with you some thoughts, some reflections that I have on this changing era. Keep in mind that, historians, especially old historians, I've been teaching for about 38 and a half years. I think we reach a point, a very humble point in our careers, where we realize that we don't have the same or any predictive powers that we thought that we had, at least some inkling. And so one of the things that I have been struggling with over the last couple of years is this notion of, why is it so difficult for us as historians to be able to predict certain things? And I can recall when the professor, James McKee, he's known primarily for a book that he wrote, a little small book on blacks in Grand Rapids. It had to probably be in the 1960s. And when Professor McKee was teaching sociology in the 60s and we were taking his classes, I remember he mentioned that he was very embarrassed, and other scholars were very embarrassed, because they could not predict the civil rights movement. They said, how did we miss the civil rights movement? What were we doing that we were completely out of the loop? And when we think about the Obama election, the day after the election, I was still in a trance. I'm an American historian. I deal with recent American history. I had no idea that a black president would be elected in my lifetime. And even as I looked at the newscast, I remember I took a short break just to go to the restroom. And when I got back, there was this piece on the screen that said Obama is the next president. And I thought it was just an ad. I figured, well, it's a commercial, and, the Obama campaign is doing it. And I sat there, this 69-year-and-a-half-old professor, and I was shocked. I was shocked. Nothing in my training or my experience prepared me to ever believe that there would be a black president in my lifetime. And I'll read some quote from people like John Lewis who said the same thing. And so tonight what I would like to do is focus on maybe 6 points. Hopefully I'll be able to get through them all. I would like to focus on this notion of it will not happen in my lifetime, what that means and what it has meant for people of my cohort. And then I want to talk just a little bit about what were the events that shaped my generation. And I hear this a lot, my graduate students and my undergraduate students, when they get tired of the lectures, they will say, tell us how it was growing up in the 50s and 60s. Okay, what was it like when you decided to go south in 1964? Leave Michigan State for a while and join a group of students who were going to the south to become involved in the civil rights movement. And so they'd like to hear these stories. They figure, they got this old guy up here, they might as well, see what type of stories he has to tell. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, the events that shaped us. And then I want to talk about the civil rights leaders and Obama, because this has also become quite a generational kind of challenge. As some leaders were saying, he didn't wait his turn. They were saying that about a lot of other young black politicians, like the governor of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick. This whole new brand, this whole new, cohort of young black leaders who are breaking all the rules according to some civil rights icon and moving on. So we'll talk a little bit about that, civil rights leaders and Obama, you see, as part of this changing generation. And then, friends, I want to talk about what does all this mean? After all the euphoria is gone, what does this mean insofar as the state of black America during the start of this Obama era? Or what does this mean in light of the present state of blacks in America? And I'll cite some data from the State of Black America, the annual report of the Urban League, a report that has been put out since 1987. It reminds me of what Gwen Ifill, the great reviewer and writer and reporter, said in an interview that she was giving, excuse me, on C-SPAN. She said that right after Obama was elected, she was driving through Washington, D.C., and she saw a homeless man, an African-American homeless man. And one of the first things that she thought was, I wonder what this means to him. I wonder what this means to him. So we have these different overlapping, colliding spheres of reality that we have to interrogate to understand just what that's about. Okay. And then the The next piece will be civil rights leaders and Obama, particularly in terms of what Obama has to say to them. And then the last piece that I want to talk about, I want to talk about what Obama calls and what some hip-hop artists call the Joshua generation. You know, Obama, and I'll mention this, gave a talk in 2007 during the celebration of the 1965 Selma March. And he talked about, in this church, he talked about how the civil rights leaders were the Moses generation, but that he was part of the Joshua generation. And some of you young folk in here are part of the Joshua generation. Or as one of my history colleagues call some of you in your teens or in your early 20s, the hip-hop generation. And that's a whole nother phenomenon. So these are the 6 points that I would like to talk about. And hopefully we'll have some time to answer some questions and get into a little dialogue. It will not happen in my lifetime. Okay? Now, why, as an American historian, did I reach the point where not only did I think that it would not happen in my lifetime, but was somewhat cynical about it? So what? What if it does happen? What does it mean historically, given the state of American reputation around the world, all the problems that this country has, and most certainly, what will it mean for black folk, given all the stats, all the data that point to high incarceration rates, high poverty rates among black men and women, high dropout rates, all of these dire statistics as a backdrop against which these things are occurring. Why does it matter? Okay. And so when I think about this whole question that it will not happen in my lifetime, I think part of it had to do with the fact that a lot of things impacted us in the 1960s and 70s. In fact, as I looked at the returns, I noticed that, I noticed that my grandson, my 7-year-old grandson, was sitting right next to me. He stayed up as long as he could. And whereas his professor granddad was sitting there saying that this isn't going to happen probably, there he was sitting there all excited. Okay, and I didn't want to dampen his enthusiasm by saying, I'm going to bed. I don't think this is going to happen. The next morning, after it happened, friends, I was in a haze. I couldn't believe it. And I kept thinking, it hasn't happened. It really hasn't happened. I wasn't psychologically prepared for it. And a lot of other people weren't psychologically prepared for it. And see, that's the interesting thing that we have to interrogate. Why is it an American historian, a 68-year-old, 69-year-old black American historian, was so cynical that he couldn't believe that it would happen, even after it had happened? I got up that morning and I was walking around and I was still trying to process it. Because for years, some of you probably remember, I think it was Robert Kennedy, I think it was in 1968. One of the historians in my department sent an email to a bunch of us where Kennedy had said, well, perhaps there might be a black president in 40 years. Okay? And so that was a part of it. But then at the same time, that next morning, friends, I noticed that there were 3 generations in the household discussing this phenomenon. My wife, who was born and reared in the South, whose parents couldn't vote until 1965. Okay, I was born in Detroit, and my parents always had the right to vote. But my wife's folk never had the right to vote until 1965. Okay? And there she was explaining to our daughter, the next generation, who was raised in a predominantly white suburb and had a little bit more faith in what might happen, but was still beginning, to take on sort of the era of cynicism. And then there was this little 7-year-old boy. And the grandmother, my wife, was explaining to this 7-year-old boy, your great-grandfather would have loved to have seen this. And my wife was in tears because she kept saying, my dad would have loved to have seen this. So you had this 3-layer generational thing going on. And of course, the 7-year-old sort of looked at us as if to say, well, this is supposed to happen. This is supposed to happen, you see. So, of course, he will rewrite history in a very, very different way. And so 3 generations in the household talking about what this means, you see. The other part of this whole notion of why it won't happen in my lifetime is that all of a sudden a black president, to many folk in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, many African Americans, a black president just didn't resonate with some of the things that they were mainly concerned about, because they were constantly being exposed to all of the data of the quality of life of black folk. In the 1970s and 80s, as you all know, there was a mushrooming of research on the black underclass, a whole new socioeconomic phenomena that showed that while some blacks were making it, while the black middle class was expanding, there was also a black underclass expanding. When William Julius Wilson started coming out with this research on the declining significance of race and looking at the bifurcation of the black community, all of a sudden people began to realize that, well, the civil rights movement most certainly affected some people, but it probably affected the upper class and the middle class much more than the black underclass. And so when that research started coming out about the black underclass, and then more and more research, like Carl Taylor's research at Michigan State on the rise of the drug gangs, you see, in these inner cities throughout the country, but particularly in Detroit, people began to wonder about the efficacy, the historical efficacy of the civil rights movement. And so maybe that's the reason why there was all this skepticism about the notion of a black president. What does it really, really mean against the backdrop of all of these things? And we'll return to this in just a moment. Now, let's well, just before I get to that, let me also share with you a quote from John Lewis. You all know John Lewis, who's a congressman from Georgia. And you also know that John Lewis was famous. He was one of the young men who was with Martin Luther King in '65, and who He got hit in the head with a brick and really suffered. Okay. And John Lewis had this to say. He said, "I don't know whether I will be able to control myself at the inauguration. I will be on the platform. I want to be able to see down the mall and past the Washington Monument and get a glimpse of the Lincoln Memorial where we stood 45 years ago." And then he says something else that really, really resonates with me and many of you who are in your 50s and 60s. He said, "When we were organizing voter registration drives, going on the freedom rides, coming here to Washington for the first time, getting arrested, going to jail, being beaten." And then he goes on, I never dreamed of the possibility that an African American would one day be elected president of the U.S. Now, why would John Lewis not believe all of that work that he did with King? Why would he not believe? Okay? So my cohort group, we share this citizen. Then he goes on to say, echoing what my wife said about her mother and her father, had they lived, my mother lived to see me elected to the Congress. This is John Lewis. But I wish my mother and father both were around. They would be so happy and so proud, and they would be so gratified, and they would say that the struggle and what we did and tried to do was worth it. You see. So this has a multiple layers of meaning for folks. It is more than just a historic occasion. It has psychosocial, spiritual implications. Okay. Let's go to the second point. Events that shaped our generation. The reason why this has to be interrogated and thought about and reflected upon is because it's important to understand why there's that tension between the old civil rights generation and the new Obama generation. Okay? And also it's important to understand, here again, historians, old folk like me. When my graduate students, or my students, or even my kids, I was born and raised in a black ghetto. My kids were born and raised, that generation, that next generation, in a predominantly white university suburbs. And my kids would always ask, Dad, how was it growing up in Detroit? What was it like growing up in Detroit? Sometimes they thought it was funny saying, Daddy, did you eat government cheese? That was kind of like the joke, Richard. They were interested in their experience. My son, who is now a physician, will call sometime and he will say, Dad, I never read any of your books on black history. He said, I'm sitting up here, I'm an internist, sitting up in this big, expensive apartment. All these things are happening. We got a black president. I want to know more about black folk. And this was a kid who was born and raised in the suburb. Some of my graduate students will say to me, what was it like growing up in the 60s? What were those things that impacted you? And so as I started reflecting on these things, I was reflecting on them primarily, friends, because I was trying to make sense out of not only the Obama thing, but how I was interfacing with it and why I was responding in different ways. So what were the things that really affected us? And only black males my age can understand this. let's look at the King era. And we only had King for a little while, don't forget. We only had King from 1955 until 1968. So I was in high school. I was in high school when King was doing a lot of the, during the bus boycott and what have you. And my parents were very excited. At least my mom was very excited. My dad didn't believe in nonviolence, and we'll talk about that later on. Okay. But something happened, friends, to those of us who were black males in the mid-50s. Something happened historically that scared us and scared our parents and traumatized us. You all have read about and seen movies about Emmett Till, that Chicago 14-year-old who went to Mississippi, whistled at a white woman, and was brutally murdered. Big tire iron, put around his neck, barbed wire. And he was so disfigured that at one point they didn't want to open the coffin, but his mother decided, no, I want them to see, I want the world to see what they did to my boy. And the killers were caught, and they were, acquitted. And then they got a contract to write about what they did in one of the magazines. But for a father, my father and other black fathers, raising 14, 15-year-old black boys, they were very concerned. We were concerned as black boys looking at Jet magazine because we said, my God, what they will do to us. This is what they will do to us. They will kill us. They will slaughter us. And the trauma of 1955 with all these little black boys and their parents looking at that Jet magazine, at that mutilated black boy, the message that sent, very dramatic message, was that whatever you do, you better not whistle at a white woman, or we will kill you. And you are vulnerable. As black boys, you are vulnerable. King marched that same year. Historians remember the bus boycott that same year. It was very important, very pivotal. But what they failed to understand is how the black community was traumatized by the killing of that 15-year-old. And it still traumatizes us to this day. When my son was in medical school, when he came home to visit, he got up one time early in the morning, about 5, 6 o'clock. He said, I'm going for a run. I said, no, you don't go for a run. He said, well, I was raised here. Dad, you're paranoid. And he did a generational thing on me. You know what your problem is? You still locked up in the 60s. You teach this stuff, and then you get hung up in this stuff. Your problem, Pops, is that you are still fixated on the 60s. I said, son, you are not the little cute black boy running through the neighborhood anymore. You are a grown black man. And a grown black man running through our neighborhood, okay? I said, I don't run through the neighborhood. I said, when I jog, I make sure the sun's up, buses going up and down the street. You see? So I can wave at people so they know that everything is okay. There's a friendly black man, running up and down the street. But I couldn't let my son do that. Call it paranoid coming from the 60s or the 50s. But these were the things that shaped our generation. The other thing that shaped our generation, we talk about Malcolm. We talk about a king. But we forget that there was that tension in our collective psyches. People born in this generation, young blacks, or not born but coming into adulthood in this generation. It was that conflict between King and Malcolm. Okay? And we never quite resolved that. Even though we had a great deal of respect for King. and his nonviolence. It was Malcolm that really put the fire in our belly, as some authors have said. Okay, it was Malcolm who was that sort of holy warrior who could go against the people who had killed Emmett Till. You see? And so we had Malcolm, who unfortunately was assassinated in 65. We had King for 3 years later, who was assassinated in 68. But they had an enormous amount of influence on us. And then, interestingly enough, at the same time that the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act took place, what happened? At the same time that King and others were in Lyndon Johnson's office, and he was signing the Voting Rights Act, several days earlier, do you all recall what happened? Watts exploded. The first in a series of urban, call them rebellions or uprisings. A whole generation of blacks began to rise up. And throughout this country, there were dozens of riots. The worst one in Detroit in 1967. And ironically enough, 67 was the year that we had our first black Supreme Court justice, Thurgood Marshall. So you had these very interesting things going on. The Civil Rights Act, the bill was signed. Thurgood Marshall became the first African American Supreme Court justice, and the cities exploded. And so, on one hand, people could celebrate some of the progress that blacks were making. On the other hand, they had to deal with these other kinds of things that were going on. Also in 1967, two other very important events took place. The first, black mayors. We were moving in the direction of the first black mayors. This was the era of black mayors. We saw the rise, for example, of Richard Hatcher, mayor of Gary, Indiana. Same month, Carl Stokes, Cleveland, Ohio. And everybody was euphoric about it. Years later, we had Bradley, Thomas Bradley of L.A., and Coleman Young of Detroit, same year, 1973. And I can recall being in the post office in East Lansing, and the postman walked in, a white postman walked in, and he said, well, Detroit is doomed. Detroit is doomed. We got a black mayor. And the thought that came to me, friends, was just before that, an article had come out, and it was an article that was called The Hollow Prize. The Hollow Prize. And it was a play on black expectation during a period of time. Because scholars were doing research on ethnic secession in terms of mayors. And they were saying that, well, you know, each ethnic or racial group will have an opportunity to put, their person in. And so people were saying, now is black people's time. And then this article came out, and this article, in effect, said it will be a hollow prize. Because by the time blacks get a chance to become mayors of these cities, they will be declining. And research had, even though people try to blame, the decline of these cities on black mayors, much research have shown that these cities began to decline in the post-World War II period. And that's a whole nother topic. But the interesting thing here again, in terms of where my head was, is that as soon as I reflected back on that, I began thinking, Boy, that reminds me of Obama. Has he inherited a Herald Price? Has he inherited a city that is, or a nation that is declining? Hopefully not. But you know, I couldn't help but think of Obama in the same light as Hatcher, and the same light as Coleman Young, and in the same light of Stokes. Here again, that's some reflection that we can think about. And this was also the period of time, friends, in terms of what shaped, our thinking, is that we had a very strong student movement, a very strong black student movement, and it was also a period that many of you probably forgot, and that was the period of the Black Power movement. With all the work that King was doing in the South, as many of you all know who know your history, there was still a great deal of conflict between King and Stokely and Rap Brown and a whole host of other folk. And that Black Power movement was a very, very powerful impulse among African Americans. And at this time, interestingly enough, they were less concerned about a black president. They were more concerned about community control. In fact, they were becoming even less concerned at one point with whether or not King's message had any meaning. And so these were some of the things that were impacting the generation, my generation. These and others shaped the generation. And you can begin to see at this point why we would be very cynical about whether or not there would ever be a black president. Or even more importantly, we would raise the question, does it even matter? Should we even focus on that? Why should that be the brass ring that we should grab for? You see. And so that helps to explain, perhaps some of the cynicism. The third point, the civil rights leadership. Historically, this is a very fascinating thing to think about. There is this attitude among some civil rights leaders. Many thought that Obama should wait in line. There's a whole generation of new political leaders that are emerging. And some of the old leaders are a little bit upset because they're saying that, these guys are cutting in line. These guys, they're not waiting to have the torch passed to them. They're just snatching the torch. Okay. Gwen Ifill, in her new book, if you get a chance, you have to get it, which focuses on the race politics and the Obama generation. Fascinating study. She interviews these folks. You know how Jesse Jackson felt. He said some pretty crude things I can't say from the podium, but he was very upset over Obama. He thought Obama was sort of looking down on black folk or talking down to black folk. Interestingly enough, what was going on in the civil rights movement that got a lot of people upset, or amongst civil rights leaders, is that there was a generational gap. Jesse Jackson's son completely disagreed with him and was embarrassed when he said those things, those negative things about Obama, and wrote this. There was a piece. Gwen Ifill mentions the piece. I think it was in one of the Baltimore newspapers, where Junior takes Dad to task. he takes Dad to task, and in so many words, just say, you're out of it. You see. And so you got this generational thing going on. For example, in Atlanta, there was an interview on September the 5th, 2007. Now, check out very carefully what Andrew Young had to say. This is very interesting. This has many layers. Andrew Young was asked, what did he think about Obama? Now, this was in September of 2007. Andrew Young said, he told Gwen Ifill this, I like Barack Obama to be president. When do you think he thought Obama would be ready for president? He said, I would like for him to be president in 2016. He went on to say, black men who reach too far, too fast, die early. And of course, he probably was concerned about King, because he was with King when he was shot in Memphis. Young said, it was a matter, now listen to this. He said, it was a matter of Barack being too young. He said he was supporting Hillary Clinton essentially because of Bill Clinton. And listen to this. And Bill Clinton is as bit as black as Obama. When Gwen Ifill asked Young about his comments after it was clear that Obama would become president, he attributed his pessimism to what he called a combination of political loyalty to Clinton and deep suspicion about what America would allow. Okay? Here again, you've got that fear coming out of the 50s and the 60s that was so much a part of my generation. And don't forget, my generation was the generation that saw all those assassinations. We were the generation that saw a president assassinated in 63. We were a generation that saw Malcolm assassinated in 65. We were the generation that saw King assassinated, Medgar Evers assassinated, you see, Robert Kennedy assassinated. So my generation was probably one of the few generations that was traumatized by so many assassinations. And it scared us because we realized that, people will kill you. People will kill you if you take a certain stand. Because we have seen, all of these important people killed. We were in our 20s. And many of us remember, when President Kennedy was killed. We know where we were. We know where we were when Evers was king. We know where we were when they bombed those 4 black babies in that church. These are the markers of our psyches that shaped us, so to speak. And so he goes on to say, this is Young, I had a hard time believing the Obama phenomenon. And it was not that I didn't trust him or that I didn't like him. I liked everything about him. It's just that my experience in American politics has been, somewhat, and he uses the word treacherous. You see that? What breeds that skepticism? The reason why when he became president, a lot of people couldn't believe it, you see. Also keep in mind that much of this rift is generational. And so you've got this conflict between politicians born in the 30s and 40s, my generation, and those born in the 60s and 70s, you see. And so this is very, very deep. Then Andrew Young went on to say, after it was clear that Obama was going to run, both John Lewis, and I'll mention a few things about John Lewis later on. Both John Lewis, as well as Andrew Young, came very late, even though Lewis was a little early. But they kind of dragged their feet. And when it became clear that Obama was going to win, then they began to move into his camp. But Barack Obama's election, Young said, has made us tremendously proud. And I want you to listen to the subtext in this. It has made us tremendously proud, Young says. Then he says, but it has given us, I'm afraid, too much hope. It has given us too much hope. I'm constantly reminding the black community that he never once promised, yes, I can. He has always said, yes, we can. He has set himself up as a savior of the world. Oh, he has not set himself up as the savior of the world. He set himself up as someone who articulates and represents and can hopefully lead us to be the best America that we can be. And then he goes on to say, he isn't just black. He's Afro-Asian, Latin, European. That means he's a global citizen and an all-American boy. He defies categorization. And then he says something that's kind of interesting, and you can tell me what you think about this during the question and answer. I underlined this. Then he goes on to say, the fact that his father and grandfather on one side were black doesn't make him any more of a black president than his grandfather on the other side, being white, would make him a white president. We claim him and we are proud of him, but the fact is he has not had the experience of deprivation, humility, and racism that I had to grow up with, which is good. He has the label, listen to this, he has the label without the scar. What is Young struggling with? And we all know Young. We know he played a very important role in the civil rights movement. But what's going on? What's going on as he engages this new phenomenon? You see. And so you can see this generational tension that's going on. Okay? Lewis is much more magnanimous, much more humble, and he seems to embrace this new generational shift that's taken place with a lot more grace, you see. Before the South Carolina primary, John Lewis received a call from Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton said, he said that he needed him to come and campaign for Hillary in black churches. And John Lewis wrote, you don't say no to the president. You know, Bill called. And, you know, people loved Bill. That's why they used to joke in some of these civil rights circles that Bill Clinton was the first black president. So it was more than a slip of the tongue with Andy Young. I mean, they had some interesting dynamics going on, you see. And so Lewis went. But when he got back, his Atlanta district went 3-1 for Obama during the Georgia primary. So what do you think he did? And Lewis, like a lot of civil rights folk, justifiably loved Clinton. Loved him. Okay? And Clinton and Hillary paid some dues. But he goes out and he gives these talks, Lewis, in these black churches, and he gets back home to Atlanta, and his people have switched. And so he reluctantly decided that he had to support Obama. But there was something else that was going on that you heard a lot of. There were people who, when they made the switch, said, we don't want to be on the wrong side of history. That's what they were scared of. They didn't want to be on the wrong side of history. And the reason why they didn't want to be on the wrong side of history, class, is that if you know anything about the history of race relations and social change in the 30s and 40s and 50s, people made all kinds of bad guesses. You know, we think about, just sort of an aside, we think about the great Allied commander, President Eisenhower, who the whole world, you know, was grateful to, most certainly the West, for the great role he played in World War II. But for the life of him, he couldn't support the Supreme Court decision. Warren said that if Eisenhower had only toured the South and told them that this was right, okay, that we wouldn't have had all that resistance. And Eisenhower always regretted appointing Warren to the Supreme Court because Warren helped to get that unanimous decision. You see? And so history is interesting how these dynamics take place. And so we look at Jesse. You know, he told Barack Obama, he said, Barack, we had to break the door down, which means sometimes you're not polite. You get bloodied up a bit. You get some scars. You haven't had to go through that, and that's a good thing. That's part of what we went through. I don't expect you to have the same battle scars that I did. So these civil rights leaders, as they were talking to, you know, Obama and others, they were just kind of saying, in effect, you have to give us our propers. We made this happen. Okay, you wouldn't be here had it not been for us. And so you see this tension between the two. The interesting thing about it is that Barack understood it all. And let me see if I can there's a piece here that I want to share with you, because Barack gave a wonderful talk. He gave the talk during the celebration of the 1965 I'm sorry, friends, the 2007 celebration of the 1965 Selma March. And basically, you know, what Obama said, he got in this church, this black church, and he told the civil rights leaders, in effect, he said, I wouldn't be here if it were not for you. I wouldn't be here. You guys are the Moses generation. And we're, you know, I'm a part of the Joshua generation. And in saying that, he was doing more and saying more than just, he wasn't being symbolically cute. Okay? But he was making a very important historical distinction. Okay? You're the Moses generation. You've done some things that are very important, but we're going to be the Joshua generation. Okay? We're going to be the Joshua generation, and you got to deal with that. And saying that in the black church meant a lot, because saying that in the black church with all these civil rights leaders there, it was important for them to get the symbolism of that. It was important for them to understand, and they did, that, okay, so we got the Moses generation, and these guys sitting here, these old civil rights people sitting here, Andy Young and Jesse Jackson and Lewis, all of these folks sitting here, they are most certainly very important as the Moses generation. But then Obama makes that statement that we are the Joshua generation, and we got to do what we have to do. And that was extremely important for him to articulate that particular point. Now, class, I'm sorry, I'm getting ready to say class. Always an old professor. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, forgive me. Okay. I do that at home sometimes, and my wife has to remember. Oh, wait, you know, you're not in your classroom. Okay. Now, we have this black president. We have this black president, okay? And the euphoria of having a black president, most certainly for black people, is unprecedented. But now let's do a harsh reality check. Getting back to what Gwen Ifill said when she said, that she was driving through Washington, D.C., and she sees this homeless person, this black homeless person, okay? And, of course, he's not euphoric about it. I mean, he's digging in garbage cans and trying to find a place to sleep for the night, okay? And we have seen this throughout history, okay? Not to dampen any enthusiasm, but as a historian, I can look at Reconstruction. I can look at the Emancipation Proclamation, right? And then we see Reconstruction. Then we see what Logan, the great African-American historian, talked about the nadir, okay? We can see the most certainly historical importance of the Brown decision, all right? And we don't dampen the importance of that. That's very important, and we appreciate that because it helped us move forward. But we also know that right after the Brown decision, there was an incredible resistance that had to be overcome with a movement. And we can go on and on and on. We had a generation of black mayors, right? Who became mayors of major cities in the U.S. Major cities in the U.S. But still we had to do a lot of work because those cities were declining, right? And there were all kinds of structural and economic and racial and social problems associated with this great rise in black mayors. So we have to ask the question, and this is where the recent reports from the Urban League, the state of Black America, those annual reports that have been coming out for the last 20-something years, since 1987. Okay, and so when we talk about the state of Black America during the Obama era, or what does this mean in light of the present state of blacks in the U.S.? Okay. Just before the election in September 2008, a study published by the Columbia University Center on African American and Politics and Society said that 44% of African Americans surveyed said they do not expect racial equality to occur in their lifetimes. 44%. Okay. Now they might be like some of us in the 60s and 70s. Okay. They might wake up one morning and things will be much better. But let's look at some indicators of quality of life during this period. Okay. Health care. About 1/3 of African American uninsured women are between the ages of 18 and 24. 1/3 of uninsured African American women are living below the poverty level. Black children are twice as likely to be uninsured compared to their white counterparts. African American men are more than twice as likely to be unemployed as white males, and make only 75% as much a year. Black women make 87% of what white women make. Black men are 7 times more likely to be incarcerated, and the average jail sentences are 10 months longer than those of white men. Young black males between the ages of 15 and 34 are 9 times more likely to die of homicide than their white counterparts. And here's a statistic that's surprising. It's kind of scary as well if you're raising a black male. Black men born in 2004 are projected to die 6 years sooner than their white counterparts and 7 years sooner than black women. And then there's a new indicator out that talks about disconnected youth. Of all racial and gender groups, young black men are by far the most likely to be disconnected from school and work. And this is counting those who are not institutionalized in prisons. Okay, 30% of young black men drop out of school. This is a national longitudinal study of survey that's quoted in the this year or 2007 annual report of the Urban League. The end of the 1990s, employment rates of black males not in school was 30% lower than their white counterparts. And then this last statistic is very interesting. White homicide dropped out of the top 10 causes of death for white men. While homicide dropped out of the top 10 causes of death for white men older than 44 years, it remains in the top 10 for another decade of life in black men, ending up as the 5th leading cause of death for black men of all ages. And there are other, quality of life indicators that we could quote. Now, why am I saying this? Why am I quoting these figures? We can't lay the burden on President Obama to be able to address all these problems. But there's a reality check that we have to be very honest about. And that is that after all the euphoria has settled, as important as this is historically, there is still a backlog of very serious problems, structurally and socially and what have you, affecting the black community. Okay? We have all of these major problems affecting the black community, and they're not going to go away any day soon. Okay? Which means then that after all the euphoria is over, we've got to then raise the question, and this is the last point of the talk, what is the Joshua generation going to do? What is the Joshua generation going to do? Okay. Many of you all recall, those of you who are in your 50s or 60s, that in the 1960s, when we were all in college, we had a choice to make, many of us. And that choice was, were we going to get involved in social movements, or were we just going to be content with going to school? Okay? Now, we had in the early 60s, we had this real cool Catholic president with the cool hairdo, the the first Irish Catholic president, and we thought that he was very cool because those of us who were in high school in the 50s were tired of old presidents, like Eisenhower. So this real hip, Irish dude becomes a president, and we fell in love with him. His wife was cool. The Supremes in Detroit, you all remember? Richard, you remember the Supremes started doing their hair, like Jackie. And then the young president told us something about basically don't ask what you can, what your country can do for you, but what you're going to do for your country. Whole bunch of us became involved in the Peace Corps. Some of us decided that we didn't want to sit up and just watch those dogs, biting, those civil rights, folk in the South. And so many of us decided that we're going to take off, for a couple of months or what have you, and go to the South and do some things, go to Indian reservations and what have you. It was a generation where we decided that we wanted to commit ourselves to making the world better, rather than just say, hey, we got a cool president. You see? And so we can't let the Joshua generation, get off the hook, because many people will sit back and say, well, we did it. We got a black president now. We work, we campaign, and so that's it. We can just kind of go back to the club, party or do whatever we want to do. But you see, the thing is that as Obama mentioned, you see, that we've got to commit. At that talk that he gave March 2007 in Selma, Alabama, he said, I'm here because somebody marched. All right? He's showing a debt. Okay? I'm here because somebody marched. I'm here because you all sacrificed for me. Okay? I stand on the shoulders of giants. I thank the Moses generation. But we got to remember now that Joshua still has a job to do. Okay? And then he goes on to say, the previous generation, the Moses generation, pointed the way. They took us 90% of the way there. Then he goes on to say that we still got, more to do. So then the issue is, what do we do in order to fulfill that legacy, to fulfill the obligation and the debt we owe to those who allowed us to be here today? So for some of you young folk here who are elated about what has happened, that's not sufficient. That's not enough. We can't let you get off the hook. Okay? You got to pay some dues. You know what I tell my students all the time? They get really upset, when I say, what have you done? What has your generation done? And they said, well, I said, no, what have you done? You're sitting here at college, you're sitting here at the university, you're sitting here in my history class, and you can't tell me what you have done or what you plan to do to make the world better. You see? What have you done? What are you going to do? And I think that we as professors have to constantly put that to them. It's not sufficient just to go to school and get good grades and to get a job. Okay? And so the Joshua generation has to be, given these tasks. They've got to be, asked to do something. Let me end on this note. When my kids graduated from high school, my daughter was a little princess. She was one of these black suburban kids who just had it all. A little princess, you see. Didn't like to eat certain foods, just wanted to, she was somewhat spoiled. But we fixed her. Okay? I'm a member of the Baha'i faith. And when she turned 17 years old, when she turned hardly out of high school, we packed her up. And we sent her, and there's some other folk in here who did the same thing. We packed her clothes and sent her to Botswana. This little suburban black bourgeois kid, okay, who used to like to hang out in the mall and what have you. And I remember getting a call from her, a letter from her saying, "Daddy, I'm sitting around this campfire, and I'm picking hair out of goat meat." And I said, "Well, baby, you still got about 9 more months to go. You got 9 more months to go. See you." Okay? And when she came home, she was tough. It wasn't about going back and forth to the mall. Okay? She had gone to Namibia. I didn't want her to go there because there was still a war going on. She had gone to Mozambique. I didn't want her to go there either, but she somehow got with some folks and decided she was going to go there. Okay? And when my son graduated, he wasn't as tough as my daughter. When he graduated, we sent him to St. Kitts, but not the tourist side. We sent him to a real rough side. And I remember he called one day and he said, "Dad, they don't have a lot of grocery stores in this area." And I said, "Well, what you going to do?" He said, "Well, I picked up some yams, but I don't know how to cook yams." I said, "Well, look here, baby, you better learn." Okay. And when he came back, he was tough. And so they're part of the Joshua generation. And so it's not enough to be excited about Obama, you see, because he has a whole bunch of work to do. The important thing is, what are you going to do as part of the Joshua generation to earn your right, to be a part of the legacy? Okay, thank you very much. Okay. Do we have time for questions? Okay, all right, okay.
If you have a question, just let us know. We can give you the microphone because we are taping this and we want to make sure that your questions are caught on tape. And also, if you didn't get a form from me when you came in, we have some assessment forms to help us to know if we're doing good things with this Black History Symposium. So I'll be on this side of the room and Professor Williams will be on the other side. Questions?
Thank you very much for a very enlightening and entertaining talk. There's one thing that struck me when you were talking about Young and his concern, I guess, about President Obama in the days, months leading up to the election. And I guess my question is this. Do you believe that perhaps because in Obama's background there was not the legacy of slavery, he felt that perhaps that was a distinction that was created that maybe did not create scars that were necessary?
Mm-hmm. Mm.
I guess that's my question.
Mm. Frame it a little differently for me. I'm trying to process that. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I apologize. I guess the comment was made that in the days, months leading up to the election, mm-hmm. President Obama was black without the scars.
Oh yeah, I see what you're saying.
And
yeah,
I guess my question is, mm-hmm. were the scars mm-hmm. that came from the legacy of slavery the essential scars mm-hmm. that were required?
No, you know what I think they were referring to? This was a generational conflict. And it even has some class elements to it. Because obviously Obama has suffered a lot growing up. I mean, his mother was on food stamps, so he had struggled a lot. I think what they were referring to were the scars that occurred in the civil rights movement. You see, during that struggle, I think that was most of it. I think they would have had to be very careful to try and say that he had no scars as a result of growing up where he grew up, because most certainly he had some scars there. But I think that they were saying, in terms of this civil rights, leadership, that look, guys, we got our heads beat in. We were in Selma, we were with King in Memphis, and so we paid the price. And the subtext, as Ifill was pointing out, is that many of these young black politicians were stepping out of line. And they weren't taking their turn, as some of the old guys were saying. Wait a minute, you're not taking your turn. You got, like Deval Patrick, the governor of Massachusetts. He went beyond and around the black political machine. And so people said, wait a minute, you can't do that. And he and Obama were real tight. So I think that the key thing was that, well, you didn't get scarred up during the struggle as much as we did, you see. If that makes any sense to you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Richard, don't you think that it's a work in progress, these social ills that we're encountering, don't you think it's a work in progress?
The whole Obama phenomenon?
No, the social ills.
Oh, the social ills. Yeah. Well, most certainly all of the social ills that we are addressing, that we are confronted with at this time, represent stages in the development of human society. It's very developmental, you see. At this stage of development, we see a lot of problems that are associated with the adolescent stage of human development. And we see it in this country, and we see it around the world. So in that sense, it's sort of a work in progress in terms of how we confront these issues.
You were speaking earlier about the when the blacks first got mayors in Gary, Indiana, and Cleveland, Ohio, and how they're already going down. Do you think that President Obama is going to get most of the blame for what's going on right now then, like the recession that we're in? Is he, do you think people are going to say that's his fault that we're in such turmoil, the turmoil that we're in?
Well, that's a part of political culture, isn't it? That whoever is in office during a period of time, when there are various problems, then he will or she will be blamed for them. Which is the reason why I think it's so important for the Joshua generation, your generation, or as one historian, as I said, the hip-hop generation. They can't just sit back and say, okay, now we're going to let him do his thing and we're just going to pull back. This has to be a generational assault on these problems. We the same kinds of things that we did in the 60s. We didn't just sit back and wait for Lyndon Johnson to sign that voting rights bill you see in 65. By that time, a whole bunch of us were in the South, working. People were campaigning and what have you. And so if he failed, it would be because the people who claimed to believe in the vision did not take hold of their part of the burden. And that's the thing that I'm most concerned about as a historian in particular, you see, is to try to help young folk understand that they have a responsibility during this generation of change to become involved.
Excuse me. I find it interesting that as a black individual within the United States and now having a black president, that within that change, that a lot more I'm going to say Caucasians, are actually speaking to me, whereas before they didn't recognize you or they didn't acknowledge you. I thought that was an interesting change for personal reasons. And I wonder, too, that if there's the opportunity for bigger changes, and if more people take them. I'm encouraged by what you just asked, more specifically your students, if they will take advantage of that generation of change, Joshua generation. And I'm interested in knowing, have you seen any change in the past? Because you have also asked that same question to your students. Mm-hmm. Have they written letters and said, I've managed to accomplish this and made change?
Oh, in the past, recent past, or since the.
Well, no, not necessarily connected with the Obama and the Joshua generation, but asking, as a professor, you're asking your students, what can you do to make a change within the United States? The question that Kennedy had proposed for the American society. Yeah,
I've been very. That's a great question. I've been very proud of my students. I've taught courses on multiracial community building and race relations for many years, and I think now. In fact, when I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking about one of my first students that I taught back in in the early 1970s, who's now a professor at Michigan State University, Arab American student who, she's no longer a student, she's a professor, who's doing incredible work, going back and forth to South Africa. I taught her when she was about 17 years old. She has been training students to do work in South Africa and in other places. She has a project in South Africa that deals with AIDS orphans. And one of my proudest moments was when I went with her to teach race relations, and there she was in South Africa, building homes for some of these orphans and working with domestic workers, and that really warms your heart, when you see that type of work. And she is making sure that her students are involved in outreach programs.
I think we have a question on that side of the room.
Mm-hmm. Well, my daughter is half Tlingit Indian from Alaska, and when President Obama was elected, she said it empowered her. And I lived in Alaska, and I'm just as red as I am white. So I've come to the point of having to call myself pink because I've had to get that red and white to be reconciled. And obviously, I've pondered what it's been like for President Obama all those years of getting those two parts to be able to walk together. And like yourself, I became a Baha'i, and I'm very aware of that power of diversity coming together to be unified. So I can see why possibly President Obama ran, not just because he was black, but he realized he brought maybe a lot of diversity to really help us to understand and come at solutions. So I see that's why so much of his diplomacy is coming from that. So some of us who've lived that life, we walk with him in prayer.
My grandson is African American and Iranian. And I remember sitting with him and saying, you share some things with Obama, you see. And so he's beginning to identify, with the whole multiracial, you see, vision, of America.
Thank you for this talk, Dr. Thomas. What I see is empowering not only to students, but also to your generation and my mother's generation, is that President Obama has asked for people around the country to have house parties, get communities together, no matter how large they are or how small, and sit around gathering ideas for solutions and sending them to him. Now, I consider that consultation. I don't ever recall a president considering the American public's opinion like that before. And so I don't know that there's a question forming here. There probably is. Do you see that as a positive in the universities as mushrooming into something larger, campus for campus for campus for campus, in helping clear a pathway, so to speak, finding solutions, because our president said he can't do it alone.
Yeah.
And I've never heard that before. So I'm somewhere between your generation and who you're teaching. And I find that amazing and empowering.
Well, you know, your idea about the role of universities in all of this is crucial, because I've always felt, in terms of the 38 and a half years that I've been teaching, that the university is really an incubator. And I remember I used to put on the screen for my students a sort of a diagram showing them coming in, you know, from generally homogeneous backgrounds and coming into a university that's very mixed, you see, and multiracial and multicultural, and then leaving with different types of skills. And I would always point out to them that if, while you're at the university, you do not take advantage, you see, of this multiracial culture, then you have really missed a great opportunity. And several years ago, the student that I was mentioning to you, who was a professor, we started a program called the Multiracial Unity Project. And that project, we started it primarily because black and white and other students in the dorms tended to sit at different tables, and they didn't interact that much. And so we began an organization that got them together. We took them on field trips. We put them in certain types of classes, and they became change agents, you see. And these were kids from predominantly black environments, Latino environments, and white environments who had never had an opportunity to interact. And one of the messages that I used to point out to my colleagues was that as professors, you know, we should play a much more important role in building that multiracial, multicultural classroom, you know, as well as out of classroom experience, you know, for our students.
All right. Well, we'd like to thank you for coming today and giving us a lot of food for thought. I did want to, so thank you so much, Dr. Thomas, and you can get a round of applause.
Thank you.
I would like to remind you all that we do have other events this week. Tomorrow, from 2 to 3:30, we have Professor David Cope from here at GRCC giving a talk about a look at African American drama. Then on Wednesday, we have Dr. Dan Lerner at 9:30 in the morning, giving a speech about Many People, One Multi-Ethnic Movement. And then from 6 to 7:30 that night, we have Dr. Randall Jelks from the University of Kansas, presenting a paper on Black History Month after Obama. Is America really post-racial? And on Thursday, we finish up finally with Professor Harold Lee from 2 to 4 p.m. From GRCC, giving a talk about selected writings of Dr. Martin Luther King. And all of those talks will be in this room. So thanks a lot, and I really appreciate you all for being here tonight, and we hope to see you later this week.
Okay.